In these notes here, we're going to cover pretty much a little bit of what we've learned about evolution since Charles Darwin in the mid to late 1800s. So, at the same time as Darwin, from 1856 to 1863, and we'll come back to this after we finish evolution because we're going to start genetics, and when you talk about genetics, you have to talk about this guy. His name is Gregor Mendel, and he is considered the father of genetics. And so Darwin didn't have an explanation for how traits get passed between parent and offspring. So he knew that they did, and most people at the time obviously knew that they did because parents often and their kids look so similar, but they didn't know how. How is that happening? How do parents and children inherit traits? How does the survival of the fittest work, where the fittest gets to reproduce, but what is it passing on to its kids? And again, Darwin had no concept of genetics. He just knew that this was happening. So in about the same time, 1856 to 1863, there was Gregor Mendel, and he was growing his pea plants, and he was proving genetics and inheritance. He also knew nothing about DNA, but he knew there was something. He called it particulates. He knew something was being passed on from parent to child that was giving the child the same traits as the parent. And that is very important for evolution because organisms can't evolve without something being passed on to them, some sort of inheritance. That's really important for evolution. And then DNA, 100 years later, in 1953, we talked about these people before. You have Watson and Crick here. They discovered the structure of DNA. They didn't discover DNA. We knew DNA already. But they did discover the structure. Now we can finally draw it and see what it looks like. And this is the molecule. This is how it happens. This is how parents end up passing something on to their child, which gives them those traits which best able to help them to survive. So DNA was the answer. And then the discovery of mutation. Not only can DNA pass on codes for building protein, it can also change. And that's a really important part of DNA as well. Change is really important for evolution. So you get occasional mutations or copying errors, and that can happen like anytime when the DNA is being copied, or it can happen, if you go out in the sun and expose yourself to some sort of chemical mutagen. And so mutations may be caused by radiation, viruses, carcinogens, and they're pretty common. You're going to get a couple million of them every day, and they often don't do anything to you, but they occasionally can change your DNA and give you a new trait which didn't exist before in the population. And if that does happen, and that trait is a good trait, then evolution and natural selection is the process that is going to spread that good trait throughout the population. An example of that was, being able to drink milk as an adult. That's not something that humans for, tens of thousands of years had the ability to do. But about 7,000 years ago, some humans got a mutation that allowed them to continue to drink milk without getting, the diarrhea that we typically associate with lactose intolerance. And those people would have had healthier bones, they would have had healthier teeth, they would have been able to have more children, their children would have inherited the lactose tolerance gene, and that would have helped them to survive. And so that's how mutation and evolution work together to cause changes in a population. Variation is also an important part of evolution. So some mutations will persist around and they will increase genetic variation. So mutation leads to variation. And variants are known as alleles. You'll hear that a lot more when we get to genetics. But different copies of the same gene are known as alleles. So there are alleles for eye color in the human population, and those alleles could be blue, they could be green, they could be brown, they could be hazel, they could be red. All the different colors of eyes that exist in the human population are alleles. And so here, alleles for hair color and for dark hair color, those are different copies of the same gene. Here you have a bunch of white girls. They all look relatively similar. However, there is variation. Even though they're all white girls, they're not exactly the same. There is variation here. Even though they do look similar, there are differences. It's like when we look at, a group of pigeons. It's like, oh, y'all look like pigeons. But there are differences there. And they can be hard to see but that little variation can lead to some organisms being better able to survive than others. All right, another one is homology. Again, something Darwin didn't know about. So when you look at the bone structure in organisms that you think are genetically related to each other, what you're gonna see is similarities. Here are mammals, and there are similarities in the fins of a whale, and the paw of a cat, and the arm of an ape, and the wing of a bat, and they're all homologous, homo meaning same, because they share similar ancestry. These are all mammals, so they all evolved from the same first mammal species, which was probably something that looked a bit like a mouse or a rat. Very small organism, but then all of these organisms, including you, evolved from that. So what you'll see in arm structures is you'll see one top bone, two middle bones, lots of little bones, and then digits. And you see the same thing in a bat. One arm bone, two middle bones, lots of little bones, and then the digits. Here is a cat. One top bone, two middle bones, lots of little bones, and the digits. Same thing in a whale. Do whales have fingers? No, but they still have one arm bone, two in the middle, lots of little ones, and then digits. They still have finger bones, even though they don't have any fingers. Same things with bats. And the reason they have this is homology. They evolved from an organism that had this structure, and they adapted it in various ways. Alright, so here are vestigial structures. So evolution doesn't progress in just one direction. Like we pick a direction and we just go for it. And so sometimes structures that evolve, they then de-evolve. So like in whales, if whales evolved from organisms on land, like a horse or a rat or, a hippo, then whales need to, eventually get rid of their back legs. Like when you look at a killer whale today, they don't have back legs. But if you look at the bones, they still have pelvic bones, which is where their legs would have attached. And that's a vestigial structure. And you have some vestigial structures as well. So an example, if you look at, a human spine here, you have this curve here, and this is called your coccyx. And this is also known as the tailbone. And this would be the extension that would have led to a tail if you had one, but you don't. And so this little curve here is completely unnecessary. And it is just evidence of past ancestry. Our, past ancestors go back, 50 million years, they had tails, and we have gotten rid of them, but we haven't completely shrunken that part of the tailbone yet. Another example would be the appendix. It's believed that the appendix was very important back when humans were eating raw food and we weren't cooking our food, and maybe it had some enzymes to help you digest raw food, but we don't do that anymore. So we have an appendix, we can live without it, but it's not currently serving a whole lot of purpose, and it continues to get smaller over time. So structures change, and that's evidence of our past ancestry. The fossil record has provided huge evidence for evolution. So as we dig stuff up, we now know where it fell on the development of, Earth. And so here is the origin of Earth. And then we have evidence that bacteria colonized Earth about 50 million years in. There was life here. It was, still a volcanic, molten, constantly being bombarded by asteroids, very little atmosphere for protection. Like, it was a horrible place to live, but bacteria still found a way to live here. And then, you start to see more complex life about 2 million years in from the development of the Earth, so we can get more complicated cells, not just these single rod-shaped bacteria, but now we're starting to see, flagella. They can swim around a bit. You can start to see more complicated organelles. And then way down over here are the dinosaurs, and we're right over here. So all of this stuff in here was life and evolution and millions of years of it. And the fossil record provides us with some of the best evidence for evolution comes from these fossils. Artificial selection we'll spend a bit more time on next week because it's an example of evolution and how nature can do it, but we do it. All of these dogs that you see here, they were not created by nature. Nature had nothing to do with this. This is people, and people do artificial selection just like nature does natural selection. And so that's a little bit of evidence for evolution, because if we can do it, so can nature. And the way we selected to breed is the same kind of way that nature does it, except we're selecting for certain things that nature may not necessarily care about, like looks, like, oh, is this dog cute? Like, nature doesn't necessarily care about that. Although you will listen to a podcast this week that talks about, does evolution actually care about beauty? Is there something like intrinsically beautiful in the natural selection methods that are done in nature? So I'll leave that up to you to decide whether evolution cares about attractiveness or not. So all breeds of dogs are in the same species, so they're all Canis lupuses, and they all are related to the wolf, but the way they got here was through human selection. And this is not the only thing that we've artificially selected. An example, this, some of our best glimpses at what food used to look like is through paintings. This, you can probably tell, is a watermelon, and you can see that it doesn't look a whole lot like today's watermelon. It's got more of the rind part in the center. Also, people describe this as being slightly bitter and salty. So it's taken a lot of artificial selection to give us the incredibly sweet and seedless watermelon that you have today. So we did that through artificial selection, through picking the plants to breed, until eventually we got what we wanted out of that. This, can you guess what it is? This was an ancient banana. This is what bananas look like. See all the seeds? When you open a banana, you don't see this at all. And we, through breeding, have made seeds pretty much disappear, which from the plant's perspective doesn't make any sense. Fruit is to disseminate seeds, but when you're eating a fruit, it's like, oh, that's obnoxious to have all those seeds in there. So we bred out the seeds. But this is what ancient bananas, would have looked like. How about this one? Can you guess what this is? It's corn. This is what corn used to look like. Clearly doesn't look anything like this anymore, but corn is a grain. I know a lot of times we think of corn as a vegetable. It's not. It's a grain, and it looks very grainy. And over time, we've bred it to look completely different from this and also taste very different from this. But we did that. Humans did that, not nature. And so that's called artificial selection. All right, macroevolution. So macroevolution is the development of new species. So you go from one species to two. That's macroevolution. And so two populations of a species, they become isolated from one another for tens of thousands of years, and then they get genetic differences over time, and eventually they split into two species. And so there's evidence of this happening that we've been able to find since Darwin. So the Galapagos finches, we now through genetic testing know that they are more closely related to each other than they are to their ancestral species. We know about why they stay away from each other. They've done studies on that. You'll see that later this week. But this is macroevolution. So how did we go from one species to 13? And the Galapagos finches are an example of macroevolution. And then here's microevolution, or like small changes. So an example of evolution we've been able to observe in the modern era since Darwin was the mosquito. So during the Blitz, which is when Germany was bombing England pretty much every night, people would hide underground, and they were building the London Underground in the 1900s. And when they dug those tunnels, they introduced mosquitoes underground where they had never been before. And so mosquitoes started to live underground, and they would suck the blood of the people who came to ride the underground subway system. And people who were hiding under there during the bombing of the Blitz, they often complained of the mosquitoes that were down there. So we have evidence that the mosquitoes were there in the mid-1900s and biting people. So they've done genetic studies on the mosquitoes that live underground and the mosquitoes that live above ground, and they found that they are genetically getting very different from each other, and it's suggesting that they are on their way towards being two different species, the underground mosquito species and the above ground mosquito species. And that's just because of the separation. Underground mosquitoes would have a hard time finding their way out of the subway tunnels, whereas above ground mosquitoes would now probably have a hard time finding their way underground because of all the, opening and closing doors, and that would be difficult. And so that keeps them separate, and that has led to speciation. So that's modern speciation here of this mosquito because of human intervention here in building the subway system. A lot of our evidence for evolution comes from similarities in biochemistry. You have DNA, but so does every living thing, and there's a lot of similarities there. And then RNA is very similar. You have RNA, so does every other species. And then also the energy molecule that we use. We all use ATP. We use it, trees use it, bacteria use it. We all use ATP for energy, and so that's evidence of shared ancestry, since we all use this basic chemical for our energy transmission needs. Even though we're significantly more complex organisms, we still use the same basic stuff. An example I've told you before, we are similar in our DNA to chimpanzees, showing that we are more genetically related to them, but we're also 90% cat. So you and a cat share 90% of your DNA, RIP grumpy cat there. And you share 80% of your DNA with a cow, so you have ancestry there. You would expect DNA similarities since you're both mammals. And then you and corn are 45% identical, so you even share similar ancestry to all life on Earth. And that is, in that conservation of your DNA, and that you use the same genes, for lots of things that corn also uses its genes for. And that is more evidence of shared ancestry with all life on Earth, including corn. And so what I just said was similar genes. You did an activity on this last week with your missions where you looked at how similar the genetic code was, and you built trees based on that. So if evolution is true, then we might also expect that closely related organisms are more similar in DNA, and we find that that is true. The more closely related things are on the evolutionary tree, the closer they are to each other in their genetic sequences, and that just makes a lot of sense. You would expect to be more genetically identical to a sibling than you would be to be, a great grandparent, and that's the same way that evolution works as well. Comparative anatomy, just we can compare our anatomy to other species and we can see similarities, like I talked about the arm bones earlier, that we have eye sockets, that we have one hole for our nose, that we have an ear hole, like similar in anatomy to more similarly related organisms. Whereas if you compare a human to, here a roly-poly bug or a woodlouse, like obviously like we look pretty different because we are more distantly related to this organism. So the closer you are in relation, like this is a human and a gorilla, the more similar you would expect and find that bone structure is as well. And then transitional fossils. Some of the best evidence for evolution that we found here comes from these transitional fossils, something that is the bridge between two things, or also called the missing link in humans, because we haven't found that bridge yet. But here's an example you've seen before of the Archaeopteryx, and it was found in 1861, and it has a lot of characteristics of birds and dinosaurs, and was some of the best evidence that maybe dinosaurs are still around in the form of birds, and that dinosaurs and birds are very closely related to each other. And this provides good evidence that birds arose from dinosaur ancestors. And so we get transitional fossils for lots of species like that. We have lots of transitional fossils you saw last week on whales, and how whales eventually went back into the ocean, and over time their arms developed into flippers, and they started getting different bone structures. So we have lots of transitional fossils for whales as well. You're going to learn about, you saw this last week, and you did a tree with Tiktaalik in it, but you're going to see this again this week because you have an assignment called Your Inner Fish, which is all about the discovery of Tiktaalik and what that means for evolution. So we start with coelacanths 360 million years ago. Somewhere around 365 million years ago, we start to see fish with arms. That's kind of a new thing. We fish with arms. They can live on land and also in the ocean. Tiktaalik is one of those species 375 million years ago. That was a fish that could do a push-up. It had arms as well. It also started to develop eyes on the top of its head, which makes it easier for it to catch predators. And so as we've started to fill in these transitional fossils, you can kind of see the evolution from, hey, you're a fish, to, oh, you can walk on land now, you're a reptile. And so this is or not a reptile, amphibian. They're becoming amphibians, where they can leave the ocean. They still need to lay their eggs in the water because they're amphibians, but they have more of the characteristics we think of amphibians, where they have legs, and they leave the ocean for at least part of their life, and they live on land. And so that's the transition between fish and amphibians, and you'll see that later this week in an assignment. Alright, last thing, but we will spend more time on this next week because it's really important and it's kind of a modern day problem, is antibiotic resistance. So let's say these dots here represent bacteria. The red bacteria are ones that will not be killed by antibiotics. So this is like a random sample of bacteria in your body. Let's say you take antibiotics. All the other normal bacteria, the yellow ones and the orange ones, they die. But the red ones are left behind because they can't be killed by antibiotics. So then what do you have left in your body? Only super bacteria. Only the bacteria left that can't be killed by antibiotics. And so the next time you take antibiotics, what happens? Nothing. And the more humans use antibiotics, the more this problem is starting to take over the globe, where we now have super bacteria that can't be killed with our antibiotics. And again, we'll talk about this more next week because it's kind of a big deal. But this is an example of natural selection that's happening right now. The antibiotic acts as an environmental pressure. It weeds out those bacteria with low resistance and only picks high resistant bacteria. And then eventually we're going to be at the point where none of our antibiotics work, and things that normally are not that big of a deal, like staph, could kill you because we don't have any more antibiotics to treat you. The plague is caused by a bacteria. So what if we didn't have antibiotics for that? Or, if you get pneumonia and then the antibiotics don't work anymore, or a lot of people are getting tuberculosis, and tuberculosis is becoming more disease resistant, and basically we can't help people. If their bacteria is resistant to our antibiotics, we can't cure you, and you might just die of those diseases. And so this is becoming kind of a big deal. But again, we'll talk about this next week because it's a modern example of where evolution is hurting us. And that's it for these notes here. So these are examples of modern evolution, things we've learned about evolution since Darwin was around in the early and mid 1800s.